turn this on, and then we're going to get that one. Okay, very good.
And the Duffs.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'll invite everyone, first of all, to turn off your cell phones. And anyone who's towards the back, please, there's a lot of great seats right here. You're not intruding on anyone's space. You have a nice table you can take notes on. It's a good place to be. My name is Ethan Tucker. Welcome to the Fall Machon Hadar lecture series. Very excited to be starting that up again this year. And before we even begin the topic tonight, I want to first of all, as kind of this first public moment of welcome, welcome the 22 full-time Yeshivat Hadar fellows who are here anchoring this Beit Midrash for the year and making possible really this being a Mekom Torah for the broader community. So we salute all of you and are really glad to have you be in touch with the larger community as well. Good. So with that, there are source sheets that ideally you should have received when you came in downstairs. If you did not, who does not have a source sheet? Okay, we got one over here. There's a couple other copies that are coming up. So for now, share with the person next to you. But there are more on their way. All right, so in doing this series, I had two fundamental reactions given to me. One was, I have been waiting for years for someone to do a session on this topic that would really deal with it in depth and be open and not apologetic and not overly critical and strike the right balance. And then, I'll leave it to you to figure out the proportions. Why in God's name are you doing this topic? So I want to say a word for those of you who don't fall into the first camp about why it is I'm doing this topic, and I think it's important that we'll be studying it together, and some of my own hopes of what we might accomplish. The first is that the privacy of this topic, and in my humble opinion, the lack of honest public discourse about it, sows a great deal of confusion, pain, disagreement, and any number of other descriptions we could come up with between people who deal with it in a very real way in their lives. And having a topic like this that goes to the most intimate places of people's personal and religious lives and goes to some deep places of frustration and anger, not be covered and addressed in an open way, perpetuates a situation that I think long-term is unhealthy. So giving some more airing to a topic like this, I think, is very important. The other thing I'll add, and some of you were here in the spring when I tried to talk about some overarching themes about halakha, Jewish law more broadly, and what it means to actually find oneself within the discourse of halakha, to really become a student of rabbinic sources, be affected by them, find deeper meaning in them by studying them more deeply. In my experience, the topic of Niddah is a kind of unstated block for many people to sign on to the larger package of mitzvot and halacha. That is to say, they're able to connect with all kinds of other aspects of the Torah, mitzvot, etc., and then they will have this kind of blind spot on this topic that, for many people in my experience, eats away at their ability to take seriously the larger picture. And so to the extent that we can also put that out there and perhaps, I don't promise anything, but perhaps take some of that away such that we can more fully embrace the rabbinic discourse on what it means to live a holy life and understand ourselves within that conversation of Torah, that I think is another really important goal. Those are two of a number of things, but I'll start with those. Now, I want to issue a number of caveats, and then we're going to jump into the material. The first is captured by Chazal's pithy statement, Ein dorshin ba'arayot barabim. You don't have a lecture about sex in front of 80 people. Okay. But what that's capturing, right? What that is capturing is that there are topics that are private and sensitive in all kinds of ways that make the public analysis thereof complicated and potentially kind of trespassing in certain kind of ways of people's right to a certain degree of privacy, propriety in the public square, etc. So I want to say, by way of flagging that, to kind of lay a ground rule for myself and for all of us in this conversation, that I want this space very much to be a place where anger and frustration and honesty can very much come to the surface. That people can really, as we're encountering text, feel free to raise their hands to kind of contribute to the conversation in a way that is honest, and that if something is really difficult, and we'll get to some text tonight already that will be quite difficult, that this is a space where that can really be engaged head on. But that it also remains a space of reverence and privacy. And by reverence, I mean that when we talk about texts that make us upset or angry, that we try to find the language to talk about, this is how this text is making me feel. This is the way I feel very boxed into a corner by this text. This is the way I imagine this text causing pain, as opposed to language of, this text is horrible, stupid, offensive, etc. Not to deprive you of those feelings or to say they're illegitimate, but barabim, in this kind of space, I think will do better by tending towards the former than the latter. And as far as privacy, you should not assume about me or about anyone else, and I will not assume about anyone else, that a question or an issue that they bring to the table necessarily reflects something about their own personal biography. And people need to feel free to bring things up in this space that will not automatically be translated in the minds of everyone else in this room into a kind of voyeuristic window into what this person's private struggles are. And that's going to be a balance we'll just have to navigate over the next 6 sessions, but I want to put it out there front and center before we start. So that's one. A second caveat. I, for those of you who have noticed, am a man. And this is a topic that obviously has any number of problematic aspects to it to be discussed by a man. On the one hand, I want to also be forthright that part of my commitment to an egalitarian world of Torah is to resist the notion that because I'm a man, I cannot speak on this topic, and therefore I don't feel inhibited to take the Torah that I feel privileged to have learned on this topic and share it all with you. But I am fully aware that I cannot fully speak to this topic. There are other voices in this room that I hope will kind of supplement that and fill out that picture as we go along. I'll merely quote the Mishnah that reflects on another similar matter, Oili im omar, oili im lo omar. There are perils to speaking and teaching, and there's perils to remaining silent. We're having this session, and we'll deal with the limitations as we go. Finally, I don't want to claim to be able to stand up here and kind of be able to account for everything in this topic, tie it all up in a bow, and I won't hold myself to the standard, and I hope you won't hold me to the standard of, unless I have explained to 100% satisfaction what X mitzvah or text is about, then I and we have failed in reaching some kind of rationale or motivation for why we should do something, why we maintain something, how it remains on the radar screen of halacha and mitzvot. That's a real question that everyone kind of has to deal with on some level, but I'm not going to hold myself to that standard for 2 reasons. One, the variety of human experience in response to all mitzvot, but in particular this one, makes it such that I am not sure there is a unitary answer to that question. I'm not sure that the question of what is the mitzvah, what are the regulations around Niddah all about, which we'll begin to speak about presently, I'm not sure that does or should have a single answer that cuts across all of the human race, all of the Jewish people. And therefore it may be misleading to go for one ta'am mitzvah, one reason that encapsulates it all. And the second thing, which is in some ways more important, is the reason behind any mitzvah, or the thrust, the sort of aim that that is put out there in the world by a given mitzvah, what it's trying to achieve, looks drastically different depending on how that mitzvah is applied. Right? So a mitzvah might have a certain kind of valence if you determine that it applies even when the temple doesn't stand, as opposed to if you determine that it only applies when the temple is standing. Even if it's the same mitzvah in the same Torah, the application of that looks very different. Whether I take a mitzvah in the Torah that might be bounded to the land of Israel, right? The mitzvah of trumot and ma'asrot, let's say ma'aser ani, of giving of your tithes to the poor, right? If that's limited to the land of Israel, then that's no longer a mitzvah that is just about alleviating global poverty. Because it's been taken out of the application in question for Jews living everywhere else in the world. It's been limited to saying something else about what kind of society we're responsible for creating in Eretz Yisrael. To the extent I apply it more broadly, the meaning may look very different. So the only way we can really actually answer the question of what is a given mitzvah all about is to spend a lot of time looking at its application. So tonight, we are going to look at a number of what I've called here fundamentals, motivations, and critiques in an attempt to begin the topic by looking at some of the broad themes that inform it, I think, no matter how we tackle it. But we're going to spend the next 5 sessions looking at very specific blocks of halachic material in this topic and thinking about their application and their varieties of application. And in many ways, that will cause us to loop back constantly to tonight's opening presentation to think about, well, what of the paths that we considered are we now treading on? Where did we take a right turn, a left turn, and how might we go forward? Okay? So that's all by way of introduction. And with that, I want us to jump straight into the main psukim from the Torah. So you have a packet in front of you. It has 11 pages. And we have 80 minutes or whatever it is. Okay? For those who haven't been to a series like this before, the format will be essentially interactive lecture. I'll be taking us through the various topics on this sheet with a basic outline of the material that I have in my head, but very much with the goal of stopping along the way and engaging both with the text and the ideas that they raise. So if you look on pages 1 through 3, I've given you the core material in the Torah that lays out the normative basis for dealing with the topic of Niddah, dealing with the topic of menstruation and its penumbras and the various responses to it. Okay? And we have 3 basic blocks of text. What I want to do for the next 5 to 7 minutes is make sure we're clear on the data in those texts, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what that data might mean. Okay? So first of all, Vayikra Tet Vav, which is the first block on 1, and it's in English on page 2, leading into page 3, Vayikra 15. Essentially has a chiastic structure. I modeled it, put it out here on the board, A, B, C, D, C, B, A. Okay? In the 2 A's, and I've laid out the paragraph so you can see that easily, though I didn't put A, B, C, D, C, B, A, which would have been useful. We have essentially the following structure. We have an introductory statement, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, tell Bnei Yisrael, and we have a concluding statement, which talks about keeping Bnei Yisrael away from Tum'ah, keeping the children of Israel away from Tum'ah, a term we will leave untranslated, and it's clear from the end, as it'll be clear from the middle, that this entire chapter is dealing with, how would you describe, for those of you who have seen this chapter before, what's the topic of this chapter? What kind of tum'ah? What's Vayikra 15 about? Bodily fluids, fluxes, discharges, all those great words and euphemisms people come up with, right? But we are dealing here with some kind, bodily fluxes that, and bodily itself being a euphemism, right? We're not talking about nosebleeds and colds, right? We're talking about discharges from the genitalia, from the sexual parts of the body, okay? And this is then laid out in, again, as I said, in a chiastic flow. We start first with the abnormal male discharge, what's known as the zav. We then continue with the normal male discharge, a seminal emission, what is known in rabbinic literature as Baal Keri. We then continue in D with sexual intercourse between man and woman. And then we go, quite predictably, to normal female discharge, Niddah in rabbinic literature and in other parts of the Torah as well, though the initial term there is confusing because it says V'isha ki tichya zava, and then abnormal female. Termed in rabbinic literature a zava. Okay? Normal female, Niddah, what we would refer to as menstruation, a regular menstrual cycle. Abnormal female, dealing with bleeding, literally as it says here, below et nidata, at the unexpected time, at a time when a woman would not normally be expecting to see menstrual blood. Okay? Now, there's also a parallel not just in the descriptions here, but in the actual treatment of the law, right? B and B both feature a requirement to wait 7 days for the body to reset. And if you look inside, as I'm talking about this on the outside, you'll see, right? Safarlo, safrala, counting 7 days in order for the body to reset. And then at the end, what must the person do? They bring, sorry, say again? Okay, so go to the mikvah. It says it in the case of the zav. It doesn't say it in the case of the zava. We'll come back to that in another session. So, but there is some kind of, for sure for the zav and plausibly for the zava, a purification ritual. Good. And there's actually another key piece that they have to do. They have to bring a sacrifice. They have to bring a korban, okay, which is the sure sign that something pathological has gone on, something unusual, right? Something out of the ordinary has gone on that requires some kind of sacrificial response. Noteworthy that in C, the normal male and female, there is no requirement of a sacrifice. A woman doesn't bring a sacrifice every time she menstruates. A man does not bring a sacrifice every time he has a seminal emission. Also, in these cases, there is no requirement of counting for the body to reset. There are just fixed periods of how long this state of tum'ah, impurity, uncleanness, you know all the translations of that. We'll come back to it. I'm going to generally leave it untranslated to maintain the ambiguity, not for the sake of apology, but to maintain the ambiguity, the Baal Keri remains tameh for 1 day, and the Niddah remains tame'ah for 7 days. And at the end of that time, they go back to being tahor, plausibly with immersion in the mikvah as undoing that, but without any need for expiation through some kind of sacrifice, okay? The male is 1 day. Why is the woman 7 days? We'll talk about that in a minute. Obviously, generally, the menstrual cycle lasts more than 1 day. It, for many women, lasts closer to 7 days, for some much fewer than that. You could imagine, even without getting too complicated, that in looking for a kind of, if you will, magic or significant number, the number that would most hit being on the upper level of covering the menstrual cycle, once you've passed basically 1 and 3 as plausible candidates, would be 7. And that may be all there is to it, but we can talk about that more. Okay? But that's the key structure of what goes on here. This chapter does not at all discuss the question of sex with a menstruant, with a zava, in any way that is explicitly prohibitive. All it addresses is the notion that if a man sleeps with a woman who is in Niddah, then he becomes tameh for 7 days, as she is tame'ah for 7 days. It is presented as a consequence. Now, whether this chapter assumes a prohibition is something that scholars argue over. In fact, Jacob Milgram, between volume 1 and volume 2 of his commentary on Leviticus, reversed himself. Suffice it to say, without getting into the question of whether you would deduce a prohibition from Vayikra Tet Vav on its own, it does not speak that language. It speaks the language of consequence. Okay? I'll just tell this great story that we just heard yesterday from Rabbi Michael Rosenberg, who, in order to kind of illustrate the difference between the language of consequence and the language of prohibition, talked about being a counselor on a summer trip, and he was like the bus counselor. And in order to clean up the kids' filthy mouths, shall we say, they decreed that every time a kid used a curse word, they would have to put 25 cents into a pushka at the front of the bus. And one of the kids came up 5 minutes later with a $10 bill and said, "This should cover me through the weekend." Okay? Now, what did he pick up on? He picked up on the fact that they didn't say it's forbidden to curse. Now, obviously, they thought it was a bad thing to curse, but they had talked the language of consequence. And there are clearly things that trigger tum'ah in this chapter that are not assumed to be forbidden, like intercourse between a man and a woman, which renders both of them tmeim. They have some kind of consequence that they have to go through some sort of purification rite. But we would never dream of saying, yeah, Leviticus 15 thinks that it's forbidden to have sex. So that's left undiscussed as to whether there's actually some kind of prohibition of having sex during menstruation in chapter 15. All right? Now, moving on. Don't worry, we'll get more interactive once we're through this piece. Vayikra Yud Chet, which is on the bottom of 1 and in the middle of 3. Here we get our first clear statement in the Torah of a prohibition. Ve'el isha benidat tumata lo tikrav legalot ervata. Now, I want to just note this point here. We'll have occasion to return to it. What that phrase means. Benidat tumata. Right? What does the word niddah mean? Anyone want to take a crack at what niddah means? What does that word mean? Aside from meaning menstruate, but what is the word? What is the root? What is it about? Yeah? From dava. Aha. So one possibility is that the nun is some kind of extra thing at the beginning, and it means dava, and dava means some kind of illness, weakness, etc. Okay, so that's one possibility. Yeah? Nadad, in the sense of wandering. And what would that mean? How would that apply here? Okay, a possibility, but we're not quite sure how we connect. Yeah? Nidui, all right? And that would imply someone being cast out in some way, right? All right, if you look at Jacob Milgram on this, he'll say Niddah. He thinks the most plausible root is casting out. He posits, I'm not actually really sure, to be honest, where he gets this from, but he posits originally it is referring literally to the blood being cast out of the woman's body, and later gets borrowed to be a term that goes more in the direction of nidui, a kind of social casting out that reflects the pushing away of the menstruous woman from the workings of society. All right, we'll come back to that. Whatever the original root is, you can go with Milgram or not on this. In the context of Yud Chet, it seems to be something along the lines of being cast out. Some have suggested that nadad in wandering may mean that, meaning pushed from one place to another. In which case, the simplest reading of this verse, which is how, for instance, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch explains it in his commentary on the Torah, do not be intimate with a woman who has been cast out on account of her impurity. Okay? And meaning, what would that most directly mean? That Vayikra Yud Chet, chapter 18, is in fact implicitly hyperlinked back to chapter 15. Which is to say, chapter 15 tells you all the ways, and you can look at the regulations there, the ways in which a woman in a state of niddah affects different objects that she touches, can communicate tum'ah, just like the zav can, right? That's talked about as well. The zav and the zava and the niddah and the ba'al keri, they have this capacity to affect the things that they touch. They are, as we know from the larger context of all those chapters in Vayikra, one of the areas that is off limits to them is anything that we would call kodesh, sancta of any sort. And this would then essentially be saying, when this woman is in a state of tum'ah, in the sense of being removed from sancta, you are not permitted to have sexual relations. Right? That is to say, it's not a text that reads completely devoid of Vayikra Tedvav. Right? Just to lay out like the radical possibility that reading opens up. Okay, if you were only dealing with this phrase, one could conclude from that reading, for instance, oh, there's only a prohibition on having sex with someone who's menstruating when that menstruation has consequences of tumah. In a world in which there are no consequences for that, the woman is not cast out on account of her tumah. Right? That's not where we're going to end up in this story because of Vayikra Kaf that we're going to see in a minute. But I want you to understand the intimate linkage between Vayikra Yudchet and Vayikra Tetvav. One is essentially built on the other. One lays out a regime of tum'ah for all these different kinds of people, and the other chapter uses that regime of tum'ah to add a law that says, and by the way, there's also a sexual prohibition here. That which Vayikra Tedvav did not engage, because it only spoke the language of consequence, Vayikra Yudchet does engage and say, this is actually forbidden. Okay? That's the difference between Yudchet and Tedvav. But I also highlighted for you here in the Hebrew all the ways in which the word tameh appears over and over and over again in chapter 18, to show you the ways in which that language framework of tum'ah is very much informing what is going on in Yudchet. Okay? Now, last verse, and then we'll take kind of a round of comments before we go on to the next piece. Vayikra Kaf is a whole other matter. Vayikra 20, on the top of 2 and on the bottom of 3, is actually a pericope, there's a fancy Bible word, that stands on its own, that has nothing to do with Tumah at all. The word Tumah barely appears in that chapter. It appears in sort of figurative ways, but not in any way remotely resembling how it appears in 15 and 18. And what does it say here? Here the language, the framework is one of Kiddusha, holiness, sanctity, not of Tum'ah. And here we get a simple verse. V'ish asher yishkav et isha dava v'gila et ervata et mekora he'era v'hi gilta et mekor damea v'nichretu shneihem mikerev amam. Here we get a couple of important details. One, the woman here is not described as a Niddah or a Zava, though Charlie's suggesting maybe those two are not so different, Niddah and Dava. But here the language is one of a woman who is weak, who is ill, and if a man sleeps with her, he has somehow revealed, uncovered her source. And the source here is clear, the source of blood. And interestingly enough, then a reciprocal statement. And she too has inappropriately revealed her source of blood. And therefore, v'nichretu shnehem. Both of them have done something wrong. And here we get the ominous and scary penalty of karet, the notion of being somehow cut off. How you explain what that is about is a huge debate, right, in rabbinic sources themselves. I often, when I'm trying to explain karet to my kids, kind of almost explain it descriptively. There's a sense in which v'nichreta nefesh hahi me'ameha, like when you tell it in the context of chametz, it's like someone who eats chametz on Pesach they took themselves out. Like they're completely out of the whole story we're trying to create here. Someone who doesn't offer the Korban Pesach and doesn't bring it, they get karet, they're out. Someone who doesn't circumcise their son, they're out. They're writing themselves out of the basic narrative we've constructed of who we are. With the arayot, too, the forbidden sexual relationships, there seems to be something that's hanging over this entire section that's essentially saying, we're constructing our entire society around certain kinship structures, taboos, certain understandings of who is intimate with whom and not. If you cross those lines, you're kind of out of the whole picture that we're creating here. Okay? We'll have to do some work to understand, well, what does that mean here? Right? How is this cutting someone out of that larger story? But we're adding here the penalty of karet. But I also want you to know this has nothing to do with tumah whatsoever. And to sharpen that for a minute, if I gave you this verse, it is not at all clear that you would come up with a 7-day prohibition. Based on this verse alone, you would likely conclude, oh, when a woman is bleeding, it's forbidden to have sex. End of story. If that lasts 3 days, it's 3 days. If it's 5 days, it's 5 days. It has nothing to do with there being some penumbra of tum'ah that we construct about that. Which, by the way, I just learned yesterday is in fact the Muslim approach to the ban on sex during menstruation. It's not a 7-day period. It's while the woman is menstruating, it's forbidden. Okay? So you should have a sense now, I hope, and this is where I kind of pause and take questions and comments at this point, of 3 very different passages. Vayikra Tetvav, which talks the language of consequence and is overall a very egalitarian passage and structure, right? I'm not claiming it's an exactly same regime for men and women, but it is a whole chapter that is set up assuming that both men and women have normal and abnormal flows, and they get different responses, okay? And I'll point out to you, this will be sort of an important point later, that in a world in which all of this is operative, it is not at all clear that women are tmeot that much more than men are tmeim. Right? What may be true is that women are tmeot for longer blocks of concentrated time, but a man with a seminal emission that can happen at any point, right, that may affect his status with much more kind of punctuated frequency than the woman is necessarily affected between normal periods. We'll get also to the developments in medicine and health and all of that have made menstruation much more common today than it probably ever was in the ancient world. But the point is that's one picture, and it talks the language of consequence. There is then Vayikra Yudchet, which uses that language of consequence to actually build up a prohibition. And then Vayikra Kaf, which stands on its own as basically a response to blood. And that is emphasized as being kind of incumbent equally on the man and the woman. Okay, Adkan with the data. What I want to now open up is, first of all, any points that people feel like they want to clarify or they need to make sure you've tread over well enough before we go into all sorts of other details. And also to begin to elicit from you, what do you make of this data? What does this data seem to produce in terms of the question if I were to ask you, what is this about? Yeah. I'm sorry, Jacob Milgram, we don't have it on the shelf. Jacob Milgram, Zichrono Livracha, passed away this past year. Was, I would say, the foremost scholar on Leviticus of our time, is the author of the Anchor Bible commentary on Leviticus. It doesn't mean that he's, everyone universally agrees with everything he said, but has done really the most kind of comprehensive thinking about the book of Vayikra, and so you'll hear me talking about him frequently. But you can find it like on Amazon and other places. Great scholar and actually like a fairly readable work of scholarship. Yeah?
What time period is the even?
The even, yeah. Let's assume to keep our purposes simple here, we're talking about sunset. Okay? Maybe we're talking about nightfall, but we're talking, it's in normal English, which is not public domain online, we would call it the evening. Okay? Hopefully that clarifies. Yeah?
Just want to make sure you repeat the question.
Yes, repeating the question. What is even? It is evening. Yes. Okay, but we'll make sure we repeat all the questions. Yes?
Why not treat them separately, especially the first 2? I mean, why read, maybe you said this, but why read chapter 18 as building on the language of consequence and not read it as, whatever you do with this, but why not read it separately instead of the same?
Because I would want to know why it says, why not read 15 and 18 separately? Why not read 18 as its own thing? I would want to know why it uses the language of tum'ah without ever telling me what that's about. If I assume it told me what that was about in 15, then the pasuk makes perfect sense. Alternatively, if the pasuk in Yud Chet had said, Ve'elisha betum'at nidata lo tikrav, then I would be inclined to say, oh, tum'ah there means in the horrible state of nidata, being a menstruate. But when it's read as benidat tum'ata, and tum'ah is the thing that is causing some kind of niddah, and the niddah there cannot mean menstruation, because of its smichut form, right? I mean, it can't mean in the menstruation of her impurity. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense, right? So that's what inclines me and Roshim Shomafal Hirsch and Baruch Schwartz and other scholars, et cetera, to read it that way, because it seems to be linking us back to that earlier piece. While Kaf clearly has nothing to do with that. right? And just maybe to retread that again, even if I said, Vayikra Yudchet, in a world in which we don't observe Tuma and Tara, disappears, I'm not saying that's so simple to say, but even if we said that, you still have to deal with Vayikra Kaf. That's not going to address what the 20th chapter is getting at. Yeah?
In looking at Vayikra Kaf, could you maybe venture to explain what the underlying value or like why, like where this is coming from? To my understanding, or like I can kind of make a case for like why you have the thing for Tuma, but why would, how does it affect Kedusha? Like can you make a case for that a little bit?
Great. So that's what we're going to turn to now. I invite you to chime in if you have an initial thought on this, but I want to